And now it's a final author talk of the day from the Savannah Book Festival. And it's Ben Blum on a robbery committed by his cousin and other Army Rangers.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the final author presentation of what I hope has been a very eventful and wonderful day for you so far at the Savannah Book Festival. You're at the Trinity United Methodist Church, which has been our venue here all day long. We feel very fortunate to have this space for the 11th Annual Savannah Book Festival. This venue has been made possible by the generosity of Jack and Mary Romanos. My name is Roger Smith, and I have the great pleasure of serving as a volunteer for the Savannah Book Festival, and I am delighted with your participation. The Savannah Book Festival is presented by Georgia Power, by David and Nancy Cintron, by the Sheehan Family Foundation, and by Mark and Pat Suen. We would also like to thank our wonderful literati members, as well as individual donors whose contributions have made in the past and continue to make Saturday at the Savannah Book Festival a free and public event. In fact, 90% of the revenue for the book festival comes from donors just like you. So it's a great pleasure to thank you for your support. Before we get started, please allow me to go over a few housekeeping details for you. First of all, immediately following the presentation, our author, Ben Blum, will be at the book signing venue for the authors out in Telfair Square, where he'll be glad to talk with you a little further and to sign books that you have purchased at the Savannah Book Festival. A couple of technology reminders. Please take a moment right now to make sure that your cell phones and other electronic devices are turned off, or at least are in the silent mode, so that we won't have electronic interruptions during the talk. If it's your intention to take photographs during the presentation, please make sure that the flash on your phone or your camera is turned off. And then during the question and answer portion after the presentation today, I will ask that you raise your hand if you have a question, and then give one of our ushers just a couple of seconds to get to you. It is very important that you're holding a microphone when you ask your question. Otherwise, viewers on C-SPAN and people in the audience will be unable to hear your question. Also, when you have that microphone in your hand, please make sure that your question actually is a question rather than a statement or a story. Our author today, Ben Blum, is here courtesy of the generosity of Bill and Nina Weil. Ben Blum holds a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, as well as an MFA in fiction from New York University, where he was awarded the New York Times Foundation Fellowship. His debut book and his subject for today's talk is his 2017 book entitled Ranger Games. Please join me in giving a very warm Savannah welcome to Ben Blum.
Thank you so much for having me here. I've been strolling around Savannah all day with my wife and 6-year-old daughter, and I have to say, I think every city should be required to have a nice little monument every 2 blocks as you're walking around. It's just perfect for strolling, but more importantly, it's perfect for hunting Pokemon in Pokemon Go, which is what our daughter is actually most excited about. My wife and I have really been enjoying the Spanish moss and Regency architecture. A portion of Ranger Games actually takes place about 4 hours west of here at Fort Benning, a very different side of Georgia. So, you might be forgiven for thinking that this is a book about war, but it's not actually a book about war. The cover does have some soldiers on it, and soldiers are mentioned in the subtitle, but Ranger Games is about a lot of things on the kind of periphery of the experience of war. It's about family, it's about the way that good intentions go wrong, and maybe more importantly than anything, it's about growing up. It's about the beautiful illusions that propel us to follow our dreams, and the way that those illusions can crumble as we get older, often making space for something richer and realer, but sometimes wreaking some major havoc along the way. So Ranger Games is the true story of my cousin Alex, whom I grew up with in Denver, Colorado. We were both kind of weird kids growing up. That PhD that you just heard about was not in English or journalism or anything that would have been remotely helpful for writing this book. It was in computer science. I was a gigantic math nerd when I was a little kid. For Halloween, I once dressed up as a dodecahedron. Gold star to anyone who knows what that is. But Alex was in his own way just as weird. He was just obsessed with the military from a very young age, absolutely fascinated with all things Army. He always had his nose buried in a book, but the books that he was reading were the kind which, if you stacked them up on the shelf next to mine, would have beaten them up and stolen their lunch money. He was into Band of Brothers was a big favorite of his from the time he was 10 years old, Black Hawk Down, Red Badge of Courage, just any military drama that he could get his teeth into. And so we started hearing from Alex when he was a kid that he wanted to be a soldier when he grew up, a common dream for a young boy, but he really stuck with it. His freshman year in high school, 2 weeks into the year, September 11th hit, and I think that's the point when his goals started to get a lot more real, a lot more serious. He enlisted shortly after his 18th birthday. By then, his goal was to survive a really brutally difficult selection program called the Ranger Indoctrination Program to make it to the elite Special Operations Ranger Regiment. He achieved that shortly after his 19th birthday. Was posted to Fort Lewis, Washington, and 4 months later served as the driver in an armed bank robbery organized by a superior in the Rangers. He was arrested shortly afterward. He served 16 months in federal prison, and then shortly after his release started talking to me about the crime. So I spent about 7 years, all told, trying to get to the bottom of how Alex, the goody two-shoes of the family, who had been almost cartoonishly patriotic and idealistic as a kid, had come to be involved in this bizarre crime. And the big question that I grappled with over and over as I went through that process is, how do you support someone who has done something terrible that caused a lot of harm both to himself and to others? How do you help them reckon with what they've done? So I'm going to sort of alternate some readings with some conversation about the book. I'm going to open with a passage about what Alex and I were like growing up in Denver. From the time we were kids, Alex always had a simple dream: to defend his country from the forces of evil and oppression. None of us took this very seriously but him. After school in the suburbs of Denver, he'd run off in his camouflage t-shirt and cargo pants to play Vietnam Commando on the canal that wove through the neighborhood, laying booby traps with dry seed pods, and hiding behind stands of cattails to watch joggers jump and yip as the ground exploded beneath their feet. He rented every Army movie the local Blockbuster carried, played every video game. There weren't many women in the ads back then, just grim-lipped men in high-tech gear dropping down ropes from helicopters to the sound of that unforgettable jingle, "Be all that you can be in the Army." Back then, Alex and I barely spoke. Our dream worlds did not overlap. By age 7, I had become known in the family as a math prodigy. In the fields where Alex saw darting commie gorillas, I saw fractally branching ferns, Fibonacci spiraling pine cones, self-intersecting manifolds of swallows. I'd tell supermarket cashiers how lasers worked, give lifeguards introductions to the Navier-Stokes equations for viscous flow. I realize now, completely insufferable. Human relations were not my specialty, too complicated. By 13, I was taking calculus and physics at the University of Colorado. The only real common ground I had with Alex lay between the tattered street hockey nets in his driveway, where on summer afternoons he would occasionally deign to scurry around my knees and destroy me, smiling up in triumph each time he scored. He was 5 years younger, but already a budding star. Our fathers had both made their efforts at manly education. Alex's father, Norm, was the assistant coach of Alex's hockey team with the elite Littleton Hockey Association and played adult league with Denver's finest, including a smattering of pros from the NHL during the 1992 players' strike. Al, my own father, was the quarterback coach of George Washington High School's football team downtown. Both raced bicycles competitively in the brutal Front Range of the Rocky Mountains, played pickup street hockey in a warehouse rink Norm had convinced a business associate to set up, skied, golfed, climbed, and pumped inordinate quantities of iron. Summers, they took us camping in the foothills, hiking through the canyons, fishing in the tick-infested ranch land of our Texas relatives. They stuck earplugs in our ears, jammed 12-gauge shotguns against our shoulders, pointed us toward the discarded appliances at the other end of the ravine, and needled us until we squeezed the trigger. It all took better with Alex than with me. Even when he was still in school, reports of his shining all-Americanness began filtering in, shoveling snow for an elderly neighbor, coaching little kids at hockey camp, defending classmates against bullies at Littleton High School. Though he was flying to tournaments all over the country with his nationally ranked club hockey team, he became more and more serious about the Army thing. It seemed to me as if he had bought himself ready-made off a toy store display rack, a G.I. Joe action figure self, and now that he had the basic model, a world of attachments and product tie-ins were available to him. His would be a life of heroic accomplishment, an American life, a Blum life, a triumph. So I knew when I published Ranger Games that some people were going to take it as an anti-war book, but it's really not that either. Through talking to Alex and a number of other soldiers, I gained a huge appreciation for their bravery, their discipline, their integrity, and the deep care that they show each other. Alex and I were both raised on stories of our grandfather, Al Sr., who served in the Army in World War II. He landed in Normandy shortly after D-Day. And although those stories meant more to Alex than they meant to me, I've also come to appreciate the warrior ethos that he passed down through his sons, the deep bonds of trust with one's fellow soldiers, and the willingness to just keep on going no matter how tough and how painful it gets. In the Ranger indoctrination program that Alex went through after basic training, he and his buddies endured hell together. They, at one point, had to group up into teams of 6 and hold telephone poles aloft for 48 hours, taking naps and brief shifts underneath them. That was just 2 days out of a month-long process of extreme physical pain and endurance. After surviving the cut, most soldiers quit, but Alex did not. He was posted to Fort Lewis and began learning what his new job would entail as a cherry private under the guidance of the Tabs, higher-ranking soldiers who had seen combat. So this next passage is about the way that formal training spilled over into the more informal settings that soldiers visited in their off hours. Those months were transformative for all the cherry privates. At night and on weekends, they ventured into Tacoma with new eyes. Every door was a potential breach point. Every bar counter a red zone concealing hidden gunmen. Every Denny's dining room partitioned into lines of fire. Civilians looked more and more like another species entirely. Cherry privates watched in bemusement as men and women with giant poofs of hair puzzled over menus, smoothed napkins over their laps, wiped their children's mouths. One night, after raiding airplane hangars, Alex and his buddies went out to see the new X-Men movie at the AMC multiplex near the highway. And all they could talk about, lined up there in the dark among teenagers who had no idea they were surrounded by Rangers, was how simple it would be to take down the theater. They all tried to outdo each other in assessment of the tactical problem, which was almost identical to that of a hangar. 3 exits, red zone in the projectionist booth, big interior space with a bunch of sheep to herd, piece of cake. Talk of hitting spots around Tacoma was a reliable way to show off knowledge and sound hard, a real-world application of their classroom sessions, planning raids on satellite photos of Al-Qaeda complexes. Whenever they watched heist movies, they laughed at how much better they could do the job themselves. Tabs were fluent in the lingo of tactical planning, but the sharper of the privates were already picking it up. In this, PFC Blum was lucky to enjoy the special mentorship of Specialist Summer. Even after his replacement as Blum's team leader, the specialist popped in once in a while as Blum broke down M16s or shined boots to ask him for a ride into town. He was friendlier to the privates than other tabs were, taking more than a few of them out to facilities around Tacoma to war game. But Blum seemed to be a favorite of his. Summer thought the silver Audi his father had given him for use at battalion was cool, nicknaming it the Transporter after one of his favorite movies, in which a disillusioned Special Forces operator runs criminal errands in an Audi A8. Blum tried to hide his nervousness about the stick shift. No matter where Summer wanted to go, Chili's, Starbucks, Quiznos, Dairy Queen, the supermarket, a porn shop, he made a little lesson out of it. Where's our infill? Side door, by the booths. Right. Red zones? By the counter, from the kitchen, behind that soft serve thing. You forgot the bathroom, Blum. Bang, you're dead. All of us were completely flabbergasted by Alex's arrest, as you might imagine. And the first question that came to all of our minds was, why? Why? Like, where did this come from? And gradually, the story began to filter out. Alex's father wasn't able to visit him for the first couple of weeks that he was in detention. Finally, he got in to talk to him. Through him, the story came to the rest of us. Apparently, Alex had believed the plans for the bank robbery were just one more of Specialist Summer's little games, a training exercise that suddenly got real. And some further reports began filtering out of some very strange stuff going on in Alex's head while he was in prison. It seemed that he was in some kind of weird, delusory state that none of us could quite wrap our minds around. Finally, later, he told us that even after his arrest, when he was being held in federal detention, he had been waiting every day for some representative of the 2nd Ranger Battalion to appear and tell him there'd been some kind of giant mix-up. It had been a training exercise, and they would send him to Iraq to be with his unit where he belonged. When I began talking to Alex in depth about the crime, he seemed so fragile and so adamant about it, so earnest and searching in his effort to convey the bizarre truth of what had happened to him, that I felt it was my job to, as his friend and as his cousin, to support him. But the more research I did as I started to write the book, the more evidence I found that suggested that things were a little bit more complicated than Alex was letting on. It was right in the thick of all the family tension created as I started trying to get to the truth that Dr. Philip Zimbardo, the social psychologist most famous for the Stanford Prison Experiment, who had actually contributed to Alex's legal defense, called Alex up and asked him to appear on a special episode of the Dr. Phil Show titled When Good People Do Bad Things. The next passage I'm going to read is from the taping in Hollywood, where I was in the studio audience. And by the time of this taping, I was just a total nervous wreck. I had this sort of sense that Alex might be lying to me and the family, but I didn't have the evidence to prove it. And the general sense in the family seemed to be that Alex was so confused and traumatized by his experience that the real story wasn't accessible to him at all, if it existed in the first place. I was just, Dr. Phil's big catchphrase is, get real. The idea is, just get real about your problems. And I was so terrified that Dr. Phil was going to call BS on Alex, tell him to get real about this crazy story, and on national television in front of 3 million Americans at this incredibly sensitive moment when I was trying to support him and get at the truth. So this is from the moment in that taping when we got to Alex's segment after some very cheerful prior segments on the Stanford Prison Experiment and Abu Ghraib. Lights. Action. Dr. Phil emitted another gorgeous clopping gout of Texan grammar. sentences that galloped off through tilting ranchland to the horizon. Now I have a world-famous psychologist and renowned author, Dr. Philip Zimbardo, is here with us today, and we are discussing his book, The Lucifer Effect, Understanding How Good People Turn Evil. Let me tell you something. You need to read this book, and you need to read it twice. Then you need to give it to your kids. Zimbardo chuckled in a heroic effort at impersonating someone who had not just made tens of thousands of dollars. Alex was sitting stiffly in his chair, one shoulder higher than the other, eyes alternating between McGraw and the audience. That's Dr. Phil's last name. He doesn't publicize it much. I mean, it really is very, very insightful, continued Dr. Phil. Today we're talking about when good people do bad things. Now, obeying authority is rule number 1 in the military. But I want you to look what happened when one former Ranger says he thought he was following routine orders. Zimbardo and Alex turned in their chairs to look at the screen on the back of the stage, where, in place of the swirling Dr. Phil logo, an 8-foot-tall Alex stood in his tidy basement bedroom, head bowed, digging an old camo fluff and buff out of his closet. The drum beat started up almost at once. What followed was a short series of edited-together sentences in Alex's voice, each of which I had at one time or another heard him saying to me, not one of which was individually untrue, though the only possible unifying interpretation was of some kind of bizarre military delusion that none of us civilians could begin to comprehend. The music finished. There was a big pause. "Okay," said Dr. Phil with a kind of a sigh. He leaned forward in his chair and scrutinized Alex from underneath skeptical, inward-pointing brows. Having not been in this situation, all of us right now are saying, "Now wait, what?" Alex went through one of his patented full-body fidgets. "So what you're telling me," Phil continued, spreading out all 10 of his fingers in an unprecedented double let's-get-real hands, a motion somewhat akin to Emperor Palpatine shooting electricity from his fingertips into the spasming body of Luke Skywalker, "is that you did not know," Phil now began actually slapping his clenched fist with the palm of his other hand to punctuate each word, "that you were involved in an armed robbery of a bank?" Alex lost his job after that episode aired. He had been coaching 5-year-olds at a local ice arena, the first job he'd managed to find since his release from prison that he was truly passionate about. It's very hard finding work as a felon in America. He became increasingly bitter and hard to talk to about the robbery. Instead, I found myself turning to Luke Elliott Summer, the ringleader of the robbery, a very intelligent, very charismatic guy who had committed a host of other crimes after the robbery, including stabbing one of his co-conspirators in prison and trying to put a hit out on his prosecutor. I ended up developing a strangely close relationship with him. He was obsessed with math, the same subject I was obsessed with as a kid. He was even working by correspondence with a professor at San Francisco State University who seemed to think he was a genius at it. Summer admitted directly to me in our conversations about his childhood that morality had always been a mystery to him. But paradoxically, this made him much easier to talk to about the robbery than Alex. Alex had such a hard time accepting that he had done anything wrong. But Summer had no real sense of wrong at all. It made me wonder if the growing difficulty of my relationship with Alex had something to do with some kind of unprocessed guilt inside him that he wasn't letting on about. So this next passage is from the one in-person interview that I managed to secure with Summer at a rural penitentiary in Kentucky. It was 7 hours straight, sitting in this dismal little visitation room. As my time with Elliot wound down, he goes by Elliot, we talked briefly about the additional sentences he had received for his final 2 offenses, stabbing Nathan Dunmall and trying to put a hit out on his prosecutor, Mike Dion. He corrected me about my understanding that he had received 10 years apiece. That was just the way it was structured, he said. Really, it was two 20-year sentences which he was serving concurrently, part of a plea deal in which the government knocked down the charges to assault with a deadly weapon and solicitation to commit a crime of violence. I asked why the authorities were willing to do that. I think my prosecutor finally realized I'm batshit insane, he said. But he sent me to prison anyway. That still got me hot. On the last phrase, Elliot's voice dropped into a menacing register, so cartoonish that I couldn't help interpreting it as playful, like a 10-year-old threatening to blow up his school. He sounded just the way he had a few hours before, when, illustrating the intensity of his family feeling, he had painted a vivid scene of killing everyone in the room if Landon was ever threatened, his son. As we waited for his unit manager to collect him, I jotted a few last notes and tried to massage some life back into my writing hand. Elliot asked me how I was planning to represent him in the book. Luke Elliott Summer, world-famous psychopath, he offered, grinning. Well, I don't know about that. I almost wish I could be a Dillinger-type character, a rough bank robber type. Alas, he switched for the last time into his corny sing-song voice, rolling his eyes up to the ceiling in a way that reminded me for some reason of the animatronic mouse at Chuck E. Cheese. It is not to be, he said. The guards fell in on either side of us as we were escorted out to the still empty visitation room, its industrial beiges and grays interrupted only by a kid's playroom in the corner with grinning cartoon characters painted on the walls, the rough texture of cinder block showing through their faces. Elliot pointed out the small marked zone on the floor next to the guard station where he had been permitted to stand and kiss Mandy when they were married the previous month. Barring a treaty transfer, the only intimacy he would be allowed with her for the next 37 years. By reflex, I reached out to shake his hand, asking if this was permitted only after it was too late for the surrounding officials to tell me it wasn't. And then with quick efficiency, Elliot was being led to the secured door on the far side, carrying on a friendly, jokey, totally one-sided conversation with the guards, and then the concrete bulk just swallowed him, and he was gone. As civilians, and I am myself a civilian, I had no experience talking to military folks before I started researching this story. We've been taught to interpret the experiences of soldiers through the lens of trauma, increasingly in the last 10 years or so. An unspoken code prohibits us from questioning too deeply into what they've had to do on the battlefield. But Summer really challenged that lens for me. He claimed that his traumatic experiences abroad had been at fault for the robbery. For a while after the robbery, when he fled to Canada where he was born, he actually claimed that he had staged the whole thing to gain a platform to protest war crimes that he had witnessed in Afghanistan and Iraq. He claimed to have evidence of this that he was sort of withholding, and it never materialized. When I started talking to him, he was still very adamant that that had been his motivation. But when I looked through his Google search history on the hard drive that the FBI had recovered from his desktop computer, I found no political news, no protest literature, just a lot of guns, porn, and gleeful speculation about what to do with all the money. So hearing the cavalier way that Summer talked about the people in the bank that he'd robbed made me realize that what holding someone accountable means is sometimes rejecting their own account. Memory is notoriously unreliable when it comes to things we're ashamed of and don't want to remember. It actually shifts around to edit out our transgressions in a way that's very hard to control. The more that I researched the story, the more I began to see that the truth that matters, the voice that has to be given moral authority, is not the voice of the guys who do it. Alex had his account of events, what he was thinking, of all the psychological forces that brought him to the bank that day, but ultimately the story belongs to the people in the bank that went through the terrible experience of the robbery. One of those people began talking to me about 4 years ago. Her name's Jessica Stotts. She was a 19-year-old teller in the bank on that day. She was actually the lead teller, responsible for supervising the others. She was extraordinarily generous with her time and extraordinarily forgiving toward Alex. So the portion of the book that shows what actually happened on that day depends heavily on her account of the events. I'm going to read a passage from that now. What 3 inches of plexiglass can't stop is a teller's fear. Among FBI agents who work bank cases, mistrust of the bandit barrier is the subject of an oft-repeated witticism. I first heard it from a 20-year veteran in the New York field office. You have these robberies where you have a bandit barrier and the teller just shovels money underneath, the agent explained, chuckling. I think it was my first supervisor who told me, the only thing that can penetrate a bandit barrier is a demand note. Jessica Stotts had, of course, imagined this scenario. If she was ever so unlucky as to find herself being robbed, she did not intend to shovel money underneath. Like Virginia, Heather, Jessica number 2, and now Elvin Navarro, the other tellers that day, she had been instructed that a modern bank robbery was a terrifying but ultimately dangerous widescreen action movie. She knew where to find the silent alarm button, tucked away in easy reach under the counter, which would make the movie stop. It did, however, seem a little strange to her, to all of them, in fact, that in this particular branch, there was a narrow gap between the plexiglass and the ceiling. At 5:15 and 53 seconds, a man in a ski mask ran through the entrance from the parking lot, planted one foot on the countertop in front of Elvin Navarro, and leapt for the barrier's lip. Elva's cry was more of surprise than of terror, quickly modulated down to an embarrassed yelp. Later, she would tell them all that everyone had been so friendly and welcoming to her all day, this was Elva's first day on the job, that she figured this was some kind of initiation prank. It was only when the other girls looked over to see the dark figure rising above their heads that panic telescoped through the stations in a crushing surge. They all leapt back as one from their desks and stampeded toward Jess and Virginia's end of the teller pit. Jess dove under the last desk with Virg, striking her shoulder blade hard on the thick iron door of the merchant deposit safe as she went down. Heather and Jessica number 2 dogpiled on top of them. Elva burst around the corner a moment later and dove in too. "Is this a drill?" she murmured. "Do they test us on this kind of thing?" Jess had to suppress a wild giggle. "I think this is a little extreme for that," she said. "If this is a drill, I'm quitting," announced Jessica number 2. U.S. Army Field Manual 90-10-1, an infantryman's guide to combat in built-up areas, describes the Army's doctrinal room-clearing procedure. A flashbang or fragmentation grenade followed by a 4-man breaching team. While the team members move toward their points of domination, they engage all targets in their sector, reads FM 90-10-1. Because the soldiers are moving and shooting at the same time, they must move using careful hurry. They do not rush with total disregard for any obstacles. Obstacles in the present facility included a promotional display for mortgages with a faux gable roof standing in the middle of the lobby, a water cooler and a carafe of hot coffee on a credenza at the head of the line, a fat-legged play table covered in rainbow blocks in the corner by the printer, and an array of polyester belts paid out between waist-high stanchions, within which thronged a sizable afternoon crowd. The 4 men in ski masks and sweatshirts, now breaching the bank's rear door, had been dissuaded from grenades by Scott Byrne, who had assured Specialist Summer that even if he was crazy enough to do this thing, a flashbang was just completely insane. But they did move toward their points of domination with careful hurry. Chad Palmer to the far door with his fully automatic AK-47 and banana clip of 37.62 millimeter rounds held at his shoulder. Nathan Dunmall to the rear door with another AK-47, or to the near door with another AK-47 and a duffel bag full of spare ammo clips and bleeder kits, and Tigray Robertson to the personal banker cubicles with a Springfield XD 9mm pistol bearing an underslung flashlight. According to a conventional tactical breakdown, the bandit barrier was not an obstacle. It was architecture, dividing the lobby in two. The only entrance to the teller pit behind it was a locked, reinforced door at the end. After breaching at this point, FM 90-10-1 indicated a 2x2 leapfrog pattern from entry to terminus. Infantrymen were not supposed to clear a corridor-shaped space like the teller pit without sufficient manpower. For Rangers, however, regular infantry field manuals read the way freshman geometry textbooks read to a mathematics graduate student, rife with simplifications chosen for teachability, blind to the way in which axioms might usefully bend. The man whose body was now twisting sideways to soar through the gap between plexiglass and ceiling, one gloved hand planted for purchase, the other holding a 9mm Glock 19 with a red laser sight, was Specialist Luke Elliott Summer. Jess Stotts, flat on her back amid the smell of carpet and computer wires under Virginia Bradford's desk in the teller pit, kept feeling that same urge to giggle. The trappings of her new professional life loomed at unreachable heights. Drawers, office supplies, sallow fluorescent lights, the underside of Virginia's stool. Someone's legs lay across her chest. The breath of the tellers she was supposedly supervising came fast and close all around her. Seconds pulled out like taffy. The lobby rang with scuffs, cries, thumps, shouts, and then a loud metallic bang, which sparked a flurry of desperate looks throughout the pile, and then a tentative consensus that there was no way that had been a gunshot. Verge caught Jess's eye and nodded toward the silent alarm button under the counter above their heads. Jess stared at it for a short eon. All she would have to do was pull her arm out, reach her hand out across space, extend her finger up, and a pair of giant legs turned the corner into their station. The pile compressed with a gasp. A man in a bulky gray sweatshirt and a black ski mask crouched on his heels to stare at them. His eyes were a blue of such intensity that they seemed to glow through the eye holes. Laser light spiked from the barrel of the gun in his right hand, dancing in grainy red jags through their torsos and limbs. The image of herself with her arm outstretched toward the button reverberated in Jess's mind with such insistence that she could barely think. She had almost done it. "Get up," the man said. Nobody moved. The red bead exerted a tingling force like the fingertip of a ghost. I said, "Get up." One by one, they scrambled to their feet. The man was large and muscular. As he made the bead dart over the fabric of their bare arms and shirt sleeves to pause on each of their chests in turn, his voice went suddenly personable. He explained that he wanted his canvas shoulder bag filled with 50s and 100s, no die packs, no bait money, no serialized bills. Jess had not been familiar with these concepts before working at the bank and wondered where he had learned them. He sounded like a guy her age, calm and cocky. She felt suddenly sure she knew him. Had he come in before? None of this was quite real yet. "Time," he called out toward the lobby. 30 seconds, shouted a hooded figure with an assault rifle by the front entrance. "If this bag isn't full in 1 minute, you're all going to get wasted," the blue-eyed man explained to the tellers, emphasizing the point with his gun. Now it was real. Unreality is a big theme in this book. There's the unreality of war to civilians who mostly see it through big budget action movies or video games where the reality of it is given an unrealistic gloss. There's the unreality of war to soldiers in training nowadays who go through such detailed simulations of battlefield conditions that the distinction between rehearsal and show starts to blur. There's the unreality of reality television, which purports to give us an unfiltered glimpse of human drama, but where the stories are in fact quite carefully constructed. There's the unreality of Luke Elliott Summer, who was masterful at playing in that dangerous, fuzzy space of games and jokes and banter as he slowly brought all the many, many soldiers involved in his scheme into greater contact with the reality of his plans. And then there's the unreality of what Alex went through and never fully processed. I've come to see that as a big part of what keeps trauma alive inside us. A disengagement from the reality of what we've gone through, because the reality is just too painful to process. In all those years I spent trying to figure out how to help Alex heal, I spent a lot of time thinking about trauma. Nowadays, of course, we have a much richer understanding of trauma than we used to. When soldiers go abroad and have horrible things done to them and do horrible things to others and come back and suffer from it, they're generally given a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But it's gradually starting to be recognized at the VA that some soldiers are suffering from something a little different that requires a different kind of treatment. The term that's come into use is moral injury. You suffer a moral injury when you do or witness and endorse and become complicit in a violation of your morals. You know, lying, stealing, treating women in a way you don't believe in, participating in a bank robbery that you never actually wanted to be a part of. I find this a fascinating moment in the progression of therapeutic methods. Psychologists have not historically been in the business of helping their clients atone for their sins. But that's basically what the moral injury framework is beginning to make some space for. Now, I'm very glad for the increasing awareness today about trauma, but in some ways I think moral injury is even more important to understand. It's very tricky helping your loved ones deal with their trauma, but it's even trickier helping them deal with their burdens of moral injury. How do you tell someone you care for, someone who's hurting and attacked from all sides and reliant on you to defend and support them, that they've really screwed up, that they need to do better, that they need to change? I think if you can do that helpfully, lovingly, compassionately, it's one of the very highest acts of love. It took me a long time to come to that place, to that feeling about Alex's involvement. But I did, in the end, confront him with all the evidence that I had amassed that called parts of his story into question. I got very, very personal and direct with him. It was one of the scariest things that I have ever done. And the results were startling and transformational for both him and for me. That's the trajectory of the book. That's the place where it ends, which means I can't tell you how it went because I don't want to give it all away. But I have come through this process with a renewed hope in the possibility for healing in families that are willing to grapple with some of these dark stories that no one wants to talk about if they really stick with it. So thank you all very much for being here. And I would love to answer any questions you may have.
The usher will come down to the front. While we're waiting for that, I fear that I mispronounced your last name, which is breaking rule number 1 in the author-host rule book. I apologize.
Oh, it's no trouble. Yeah, it's a common mistake.
Right here.
The issue of families and participants dealing with notions of moral injury that's not a new thing for people dealing with war. And thank God your friend, it was only a bank robbery and not something else, if it helps. But how do you think, is there any support within the service and within the VA, or people who support the VA and who support the military? We do live in an area that there are a lot of people. Do you think there is any support, or do you think there is new support? What can you speak of to that?
Yeah, there are some very encouraging steps. The VA actually has a pilot program that started a couple years ago that's seen some very promising early results with a different treatment methodology for moral injury that involves finding some kind of reasonable restitution for the soldier. There are a few programs out there that bring together both Iraqis and Afghani citizens who've lost family members in the conflict, and then soldiers who may not know what impact they've had, but some of those connections can be very powerful.
What are the names of those programs?
Oh, I really should have those on the tip of my tongue, but I don't. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Do you think that the family members, including yourself, of people in the service, understand that's what they're going to be dealing with?
Not yet. Not yet. I think we've seen a lot of trauma stories, and I think in part because of the failure to distinguish between trauma and moral injury, that's ended up being a very problematic narrative for a lot of soldiers coming back and trying to reintegrate into society, get jobs, feel accepted by their communities. I think there's a lot of stigma around PTSD. You know, we see news stories about soldiers flipping out and committing crimes on base or abroad, and that's been very damaging, very unproductive. I think I would love to see some more support services for families to deal with this issue. I don't think that there's nearly enough.
How is your cousin doing today, and what is he doing? If you can give any detail, or maybe you don't want to give too much detail.
Sure. He's doing amazingly well. This secret was eating him up for years. He didn't even think of it as a secret. He was just clenched so tight around this version of his story that he thought exonerated him, that he thought showed his true character. And he retreated further and further from friends and family, the harder that he held to that. So, in a surprising way, confronting him led to a kind of dramatic reconciliation with family, and he stopped drinking. He started, training in jiu-jitsu again, which is always a good sign of health for them. I mean, he's doing really well. He has a good job now. He's got a loving, like a pit bull named Pickles that he dotes on with an level of affection that would kill a smaller dog, probably. He's doing well, and he and I have become very close. The publication of the book was, as you might imagine, very, very scary for him, but it ended up being quite cathartic, I think. He and I appeared together at a book event in Colorado, at which a number of our family members were in attendance. And there was a very, very intense back and forth with the audience, the most hardcore question-answer session that I think I've ever seen at a book event. But it went really well.
Yeah, this is such a personal event for you to go through this whole process and write this book. But as an author, where do you go from here?
Well, hopefully no more bank robberies by close family members. Alex occasionally offers, if I am stuck in my career, to go rob another one if I really, really need him to. So I do come from a science background. I love science, and I've gotten very interested in trauma, in psychology, and in therapy. So my next book is kind of about, it's a little bit about what you're talking about. It's some state-of-the-art ways for close families to heal each other from their trauma, to grow together, and to hold each other accountable when appropriate, in order to move past some of these things that stick with us for years.
Yes. Are you familiar with the FEAR group out of Fort Stewart? Started out among some active duty soldiers, went from just guy stuff, as they called it, to a plot to overthrow the U.S. government. It's forever enduring, always ready. And as one of them testified in court, they couldn't believe how it got out of hand, to the point that they killed one of their co-conspirators and his girlfriend in an effort to tie up loose ends, they said. So I didn't know, it's one of those things that started out shooting in the woods at night and just sort of got out of control. I didn't know if you were familiar with that.
I'm not. That's fascinating. What year was that from?
2012.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yes,
Yeah, those dynamics.
Called the FEAR group.
The FEAR group. I will look into that. That sounds very familiar indeed. Yeah, it's incredible the way these small group dynamics can evolve beyond the control almost of anyone in the group, especially in these elite warrior cultures where there's a huge taboo against backing down. Even in banter, if one guy jokes about taking down a bank, then you joke about taking down a casino and killing everyone inside. There's this escalation, and if you can't rise to that level of banter, then you're showing yourself as weak. It's very, very hard to back down once you've started along that path. Do we have any others?
I have a quick question, if I may.
Of course.
I might need to speak into the microphone. I don't want to squeeze you out.
Sure.
You mentioned that your relationship with Alex is all healed and so forth. Is that true of everyone else in your family, particularly his father, if he's still with us?
Yeah. He is still with us. Norm is very much still kicking and doing his 200 push-ups every morning, as he's been doing since he was 8 years old. The family has been incredibly supportive through this process. So I began this book in, 2008 or something insanely long ago like that, with the idea of clearing Alex's name. I just felt it was so unjust that he was going to spend his life as a convicted violent felon, having been tricked into robbing this bank while, pursuing what he thought was extracurricular training that would help him on deployment in Iraq. So the family was, as you might imagine, very much behind that project. We were all circling the wagons around Alex, trying to help him out in whatever way we could. And then came the really complicated years when my story started veering out of alignment with the families. And those were difficult times, but at the same time, there was an amazing amount of tolerance for me to keep pursuing this. I think in part because by then I was Alex's closest friend, and it was just so clear to everyone that he needed that. He needed someone to work through this with him. So I was worried about publishing the book, but my relationship with Norm, he read it actually. The things that end up pissing people off in your book are never the ones you expect. I was so like, oh my gosh, what is everyone going to think about the way I portray Alex? And, are they going to hate the fact that I quoted their corny jokes and, here and there and everywhere else? And nope, totally fine with everything except for what I wrote about my grandfather, Al Sr., the World War II veteran who had inspired Alex to enlist, who is the source of so much of our family lore, so much of the mythology that Alex and I grew up on. I discovered his war memoir in the course of researching this book, and learned through reading that a lot of what he'd gone through abroad was much darker than had been passed down to us. I think this is a common experience for families who have these very heavily mythologized veterans in their history. And that began to make clear that this legacy of trauma and moral injury, much more than trauma really for him, had played a significant role in making Alex susceptible to the kind of influence that Summer brought him under. And I think that deep reckoning with family culture and these sort of intergenerational history of trauma and moral injury going back through several wars, that's something that our family is still processing to this day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
I want to remind everyone that Ben Blum will be out in Telfair Square signing copies of his book. We want to thank him once again for an incredibly compelling story, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. Don't forget that the receptacles, the little round containers, are there for your dollars so that in future book festival events we can keep Saturday free for everyone. Thank you all so much, and Ben, thank you again. It's great.
And that wraps up Book TV's live coverage of this year's Savannah Book Festival.